reason that having the wrong perspective on things is the most blameworthy thing is because the forms are not the work of the Spirit. The problem of the Spirit is not solved in the forms, not solved in the context of one form compared to another, or the contrast amongst forms. The forms are just there as a context for the other dimension. And if you aren't seeing it, the sensual world, the visible sensed world, the world that the faculties bring about, if you're not seeing that as its own thing and seeing your attitude and your choices as another invisible context, if you're not able to contrast those two contexts, then you're going to be lost in thinking that all the winning is done in the world of forms, circumstantial, completely out of our control forms. And all your work is going to be fixing things that are not the problem. What the form is not the problem of the Spirit. What form you have, what forms you encounter, even the amount of discomfort you feel and the pain you feel, this, from the point of view of Spirit, has to be seen as a whole context of its own, which the Spirit and the attitude and the choices encounter in order to understand the problem of suffering and freedom from suffering. There is nothing in the forms that you can arrange to understand the problem of suffering. The problem of suffering is not between the forms or contrasting the forms in that field. The problem of suffering is not seeing the field from the invisible realm of attitude and choices. This is why any personality type, any body shape, any mental mental state or mental faculty, any level of faculties of the senses or the mentality can get to right view, because the circumstantial situation, the causes and conditions of what we can perceive are not the cause of our suffering, and they are not the solution to our suffering. Fear has a use for the conceptual self to preserve itself within this context of forms, of a perspective of limitation for that self, that illogical, non-persisting, always regenerating image of self. And it's like a little program to preserve itself within the limits of the formal. But fear has no existential purpose when seen from the right view, which is the context of, if I am not the form, if I am the invisible choice and attitude, or my source, and maybe the source of all of both realms and everything conditioned, is outside of being or non-being, is outside of being created or being uncreated, is outside of life or death, is not subject to danger, then there's no use for existential fear from that perspective. Existential fear is when the mind is identified with something in the conditioned formal realm, the realm of body and what we perceive with our senses, these things which have limits and borders and comings and goings. So that fear is always going to be present in the self that's identified in that way, and that a self that is a conceptual formal self. That self always has a use for fear because it's always in danger of changing, and basically change is death to that self if it can't grasp onto the purpose of the change, or can't quickly enough create a context for how it's now the same self even though everything has changed. It hasn't come to terms with the change. So fear in that self is a constant sort of lever or teeter-totter that self lives on. But the source, the unconditioned, sees fear as being a part of the conditioned world and doesn't recognize its relevance because it knows itself as outside of conditions, outside of change, outside of the dangers of changing forms, the selves that come and go.